Miracles and Divine Watch Care by Lester Sumrall. For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways. Psalm 91:11. God watches over his children. From earliest childhood, I have seen the hand of God's watch care over my own life. Even when I was just a little boy, Satan must have had some idea of God's plan for my life and ministry, because on several occasions he tried to destroy me before I could grow to maturity. In an earlier book, I have told how God miraculously spared me from several close scrapes with death in childhood. Without repeating any of those instances here, I can testify of several other miracles of divine watch care. See Run with the Vision. The raft that drifted to sea. When I was still quite young, our family lived in a house overlooking St. Andrews Bay and the Gulf of Mexico in Panama City, Florida. In those days, I lived in my swimming trunks as much as any other clothing during the summertime. Most of the neighborhood boys did long, lazy summer days playing at the beach. One day, some of my friends and I built a homemade raft of scrap lumber and some empty 50-gallon oil drums we found. It was our plan to take the raft out into the bay and use it as a platform for diving and swimming. There were about 10 of us boys involved in the project, and we were having a great time, busy with our hammers and nails. It was about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when we launched our vessel into the bay. We were diving and laughing and totally absorbed in our activity until about 4 o'clock when one of the boys yelled, "Hey, look! The tide is carrying us out to sea." We looked up, and to our horror and dismay, the houses on the shore appeared like toys far in the distance. Two of the larger boys, who were strong swimmers, immediately dove into the water and began to make their way toward shore. I was the largest of the 6 or 8 boys who stayed on the raft. These fellows were only about 8 to 10 years old, and they began to scream and cry, "Lester, don't leave us. Don't leave us. Please don't leave us." Although I felt that I was strong enough to swim to the sandbanks alone, I could not bring myself to leave these terrified little friends with tears running down their faces. As we drifted further from shore, the waves got higher until they began to break over the raft. I ordered the boys to lay flat on their bellies and hang on in order to keep from being swept overboard. We were all extremely frightened and felt that our doomsday had come. The sun was now sinking swiftly toward the western horizon, and we knew that darkness would be coming soon. I can't remember that any of us prayed. We just hung on to the creaking raft with the salt spray bursting over us and fervently hoped that we would somehow survive. Then one of the boys looked up and yelled, "Hey, I believe the houses are getting closer." We looked up, and to our great joy realized that the tide had turned just in the nick of time for us. We were drifting in toward some old fish houses about 2 miles down the beach from where we had launched our raft. When we got close enough that I felt the boys could all reach the sand, I said, "All right, you guys, get off of here. But remember one thing, you must never tell your parents who you were with, or you will be in trouble." After the last one of them dove into the surf, I did the same, swimming to shore. It was after dark when I arrived home, exhausted. Mother asked where I had been, and I only answered, "You wouldn't believe it if I told you." It was a long time later before I shared the incident with her. Was it a miracle? Some may say that the tide turns every day, and we were just lucky. Yet somehow I have always felt that more than just good fortune was involved in that little episode. Whether God uses a natural phenomenon or the supernatural, I believe that more times than those for which we give him credit, he watches over and protects his children. So often I have contemplated how men and women need the tide to turn in their lives. When the tide turns, the whole world turns in the proper direction. Those contemplating suicide, those who are suffering, those at the point of despair, can see the tide turn in their situation if they will only permit the God of the tide to take charge of their lives. That day on the raft was only representative of many instances when I have experienced a miracle of God's loving protection. Throughout my ministry, in many dire circumstances, I have been made to remember that we have an omnipresent God who watches over his own. Falling into a volcano in Java. On the Indonesian island of Java, Howard Carter and I were staying in the home of a Dutch banker while ministering in his city for a few days. Our host informed us that Indonesia has more live volcanoes than any other area in the world. One evening he asked, How would you like to look down into the crater of a live volcano? I was excited by the opportunity to behold such a formidable spectacle of nature. The banker took the day off from work, and early the next morning, around 4 o'clock, we took a picnic lunch and drove by auto out of town to the foot of a lush tropical mountain. We rented horses and began the ascent up the towering slope. By mid-morning, we had climbed to the edge of the crater where we looked over the side. Boiling lava was leaping up like liquid hell in the pit far below us. The stench of the sulfuric fumes was almost overpowering. I climbed out to the tip of the grassy ledge on my knees and gazed for a long time, mesmerized by the awesome sight. The fascination of this movement of the black cauldron was hypnotic. I did not particularly notice that the ground underneath the ledge had been eaten out by the living inferno beneath it. Suddenly, I was aware that the ground beneath me was giving way, as in a slow-motion fantasy. In the next moment, I felt myself falling through the air as the ground on which I was standing broke away completely and began to plunge toward the bubbling lava 200 feet below. The banker, who was standing just a few feet behind me, grabbed at my shirt with lightning reflexes. That small-framed man threw me backward over the top of his head with superhuman strength, and we went sprawling on the grass together, coming to rest about 20 feet from the fragile rim of the volcano. I looked back to see that where I had been kneeling a moment before, there was now a gaping hole about the size of a grand piano. As we got up and were brushing ourselves off, the banker said, "I warned you to be careful." "I see what you mean," I replied, and I thanked him profusely for saving my life. But both of us knew that someone greater than any human had been watching over us that day. Airplane crash in Mexico. While ministering in the bustling metropolis of Mexico City, I heard the news of a new volcano, Paricutin, which had just been born in the hinterland of that country. Being fascinated by such things, I decided to take a day to have a look at this news-making spectacle, which had erupted without warning from a cornfield and buried an entire town. Reports were that the cinder cone was already 400 feet high and still growing as rocks and liquid fire continued to belch out of its mouth. At the airport in Mexico City, I bought 2 tickets for my interpreter and myself on a local mail plane, which also carried 6 or 7 passengers. I rode up in the cockpit with the pilot. Our first stop was a mail drop at a little grass airstrip. When we landed, I was horrified to see that the plane's brakes were not working properly. The pilot pumped furiously and somehow managed to bring his craft to a stop. He then got out to work on it. Using a file, he tinkered with the brakes for a few minutes, then with a sigh said, "There, that ought to help it." I wasn't so sure the pilot knew what he was doing. However, I had no real choice but to get back into the plane and fly toward the next stop. On our second landing, the brakes were not any better. They seemed worse than before. Luckily, our landing strip was in a cow pasture where the pilot had plenty of room to let the plane roll until it came to a stop. "This is dangerous," I warned him. "You are going to have to reverse the props to stop it the next time." The pilot assured me he could handle it, and we took off for our third leg of the trip, which was to Paricutin, my final destination. On this landing, the pilot did not come in as well as he had at the previous 2 stops. He let the plane down in the middle of the grassy field, and by the time we got to the barbed wire fence at the end of the runway, he was still rolling at about 40 miles per hour. "Do something, man," I yelled. "Hurry, turn this thing around." He turned it around, all right, and when he did, the little plane flipped and turned over twice. When we came to rest, I was unhurt, but the door was twisted and jammed. I kicked out the windshield and climbed out quickly, afraid that the fuel tank might explode at any moment. I then ran around and forced open a door and began pulling out the passengers. They were cut, bruised, and bleeding, but none were too seriously injured. The one who seemed banged up most was the young man who was traveling with me, serving as my interpreter. He came out vowing, "I'll never fly again. I'll never fly again. I'll never fly again." The following day, I had to use some strong persuasion and a fervent prayer to get my interpreter on another small plane to fly back to Mexico City. He trembled with fear. God delivered him, for that same man is still in missionary work and has flown tens of thousands of miles by airplane since our incident at Paricutin. He mastered his fear of flying, which could have become a phobia to dominate his life. Sinking ship in the South Atlantic. On another occasion, when Howard Carter and I were doing missionary work in South America, we were traveling from Joinville up to Santos, Brazil. It was a 2 or 3 days journey up the coast on a freight boat carrying a heavy load of logs. The man who owned the boat was a good Christian man, and we were his guests. We anticipated the trip as a good time to relax and rest while traveling between preaching engagements. On our first night out at sea, such a storm arose as I had never seen before in my life. Fierce winds caused the sea to stand up on end like a restless chain of watery mountains. Our 100-foot ship looked like a peanut by comparison to the monstrous waves. Billows began to break over our ship, and salt water penetrated every crack and crevice of the old vessel. Even our cabin on the top deck filled with water to a depth of about 12 inches. As we bobbed and tossed, I watched my hat and my Bible floating back and forth across the room, but it was all I could do, just to hold on to my bunk. Everything in the ship that was not firmly secured was literally turned upside down. The interior of the ship was wrecked. The captain came to our room in a state of near hysteria and screamed 3 words, "We're sinking. Pray." I did pray, but things didn't seem to improve much for all that night and for most of the next day. Finally, the storm subsided, and with great effort, our ship limped into the harbor at Santos. We were barely afloat with 18 inches of water over the plumb line. During the ordeal, we had fasted of necessity. The cook had laid in his bunk, vomiting from seasickness throughout much of the trip. In fact, everyone on the ship had been sick, except Howard Carter and me. When we pulled into port, the captain thanked God for sparing our lives. He, more than anyone else, knew that the angels of God had wrought a miracle and caused us to survive. Lost over Alaska. One of the most amazing times I have experienced the watch care of protecting angels was in Alaska. It was January, and I had just finished preaching a revival meeting in Fairbanks. My next preaching appointment was in Nome on the Bering Sea. The only way to travel was by a mail plane, which had skis instead of wheels. In Nome, it was interesting to see how the Eskimos lived with their houses completely covered by snow with a tunnel dug for an entranceway. They said that very little heat was needed because of the insulation provided by the snow. The hardy natives made their living almost entirely by fishing through the ice. I preached in the school in this frontier town and enjoyed a very successful meeting with many blessings from God. The young bush pilot and I were the only ones on the plane as we took off for our return trip to Fairbanks. I sat in the co-pilot's seat next to him. Shortly after takeoff, the pilot looked down and sighted a pack of wolves stalking a herd of reindeer. He nosed the plane around and circled in low, maybe 30 feet above the frozen tundra. Taking his rifle from behind the seat, the pilot would tip the plane's wing, take a bead on a wolf, and fire. In about a dozen shots, I saw 3 or 4 wolves drop in their tracks, marking the spot with a crimson stain on the snow. The pilot told me he received a bounty for every wolf he reported killed. I found the entire episode to be very exciting. When the pilot had dispensed with the wolf pack, we climbed to a higher altitude and headed back toward Fairbanks. The little plane carried no sophisticated radar or guidance equipment, and the pilot was accustomed to finding his way by sight. After we had been flying for several minutes, the pilot turned to me and said gravely, "Sumrall, we're lost. We went around so many times back there chasing those wolves that I lost my sense of direction and I don't recognize any familiar landmarks." He explained that we were so close to the magnetic pole that the plane's compass was not reliable. To compound the problem, darkness was quickly settling over the landscape. Hoping for a simple answer, I asked, "What are we going to do?" "I don't know," he replied. "I don't even know which direction we are flying. Mount McKinley is south of us, and if we hit that, we are goners for sure. Then, if we go too far to the north and miss Fairbanks, there is nothing up there except tundra, and our gas would give out and we would be dead. We've got to at least find a small river to put this plane down for the night." The pilot was clearly frightened, and it was rubbing off on me. The long winter night began to settle in, and it was soon too dark to clearly make out objects below us. Our fuel gauge was showing just a hair above empty. Turning to me again, the pilot asked, as if to assure himself, "You're a preacher, aren't you?" Yes, I swallowed. Well, you had better pray. If you don't, we're not going to make it. I had already been praying silently, but now I bowed my head and unashamedly prayed aloud. Now, Lord, we don't know where we are, but certainly you do. Help us, Lord. Guide us. After I had thus committed our situation to the Lord, we sat in silence and waited for several tense moments with no sound but the drone of the engine and the whistle of the wind. I think I see some lights over there, the pilot suddenly blurted, and he veered the nose of the plane to the left. Soon we saw below us the dark silhouette of an Eskimo village situated along the banks of a frozen river. The villagers must have been startled by the noise of our plane. They knew that no one was supposed to be in the air after dark. The quick-witted Eskimos began to light up dozens of lamps and line the side of the river as we circled overhead. I have never seen a more welcome sight. The lights seemed no brighter from the air than so many fireflies, but they were bright enough to reveal the outline of the only smooth place available for a landing. The plane nosed downwards, and before we expected it, hit the river with a tremendous wallop. The impact jolted every bone in my body and every bolt on the plane. We must have bounced 50 feet back into the air. I don't think we even slowed down, and the plane just kept on flying. As we circled for another approach, the pilot said, "You had better pray harder. If you don't, we're not going to get this thing down." By now, everyone in the whole village of about 300 was out beside the riverbank with a little lamp of some kind. Where the river was, we could only see darkness. We knew it was there only by the flickering lights which the Eskimos held. Once again, we hit not nearly so hard this time, bouncing about 5 feet and then coming down again with the wonderful scraping sound of our skis running across the ice. Finally, we came to an uneasy halt and turned the plane around, bringing it back to the village. There was a lot of rejoicing and celebrating in the little village that night. No one there had ever seen anything quite like it. The pilot especially just couldn't get through thanking God for sparing his life. The postmaster of the little village took us in for the night. The next morning, we were able to gas up and take off, arriving back in Fairbanks within an hour. Bullets and blessings under a brush arbor, I was conducting a revival in the Oklahoma oil fields as a very young evangelist. Some of the people in that part of the country in those days were very rough, and their lifestyles were marked by violence. The meeting was being held under a brush arbor, a makeshift affair of poles and branches situated close to a well-traveled road. During my message one night, we could hear the sudden squealing of rubber against pavement, followed by a sickening thud. Someone began to yell, "A man has been killed! A man has been killed!" I heard another voice say that a drunk had staggered out in front of a speeding automobile. Taking advantage of the situation, I made a strong altar appeal. Here this man was drunk. He had given his life to the devil. Now he is dead and in hell. Passionately, I invited sinners to come to an altar of repentance. As the wail of sirens faded in the distance, several souls wept their way through to an experience of the new birth. The next morning, a car pulled up in front of the house where I was staying, and 3 or 4 sullen-faced young men got out. They rapped angrily at the door and demanded, "Is Sumrall here?" I had no idea who the young men were, but answered, "I am Lester Sumrall. Come out here. We want to talk to you." No sooner had I stepped out the door than they said, "We are going to kill you." "What for?" I stammered. "Our daddy got killed last night and he wasn't drunk." "Oh," I said apologetically. "I'm sorry. I am glad he wasn't drunk. I didn't mean any offense." "Yes, you did," one of the boys said belligerently. "You preached a whole sermon against my daddy. People told us you... Now we are disgraced in this town because you told everybody our daddy was a drunkard." The truth is, several witnesses testified that the man had been drunk when the accident occurred. One of the brothers pointed a finger at me and threatened, "We are going to get you." With that, they piled back into their car and burned rubber as they squealed away. I arrived at the brush arbor half an hour early that night, and already about 100 people had gathered for the service. Just as I walked up, I heard someone asking the pastor, "What are we going to do?" "I'm going home," he answered. "Somebody is going to get killed here tonight." He left. It was still 15 minutes before time for the meeting to start, and the people were obviously scared. Some of them began to come up to me and express their concern, asking, "What are you going to do? What do you mean? What am I going to do?" "There is a man who says he is coming to kill you tonight," they informed me. "You talked against this man's father, and he has vowed to kill you." "In that case," I said, "let him kill me." Since the pastor had already left, I got up and started the singing, led in prayer, and finally began to preach. During the service, people would speak out and say, "There is a man out there behind a tree with a pistol, and he is going to shoot you." After a while, I got tired of these interruptions and announced, "Listen, God is with me. Any man here who pulls a trigger tonight, God will strike him dead. I dare you to do it." As I spoke, the fear of God came upon that place, and the audience sat open-mouthed in stunned silence. I finished my sermon and gave the altar call. 2 or 3 seekers came forward to pray, and as they did, I walked back through the crowd. The expression of a grim-faced young man caught my attention. I said, "Young man, God is talking to you tonight." "How do you know?" he rebutted. "God tells me he is talking to you." "Don't you know who I am?" "No, I don't, but God does." "I am one of those brothers," he confessed. "It was my dad you were talking against." I had not recognized the young man until that moment. To me, it was no coincidence that I had felt led to speak to him. "Listen, fellow," I said, "I am not a troublemaker. I am just a gospel preacher. You don't need to hate God. You don't need to hate me either. But I've got news for you. I don't know where your daddy is, but I know you are going to hell if you don't get right with God." He broke and began to weep bitterly. I led him down to the altar, and as he knelt in the sawdust, he was joined by dozens of his Oklahoma neighbors who came weeping their way through to Calvary. It was a great spiritual victory for the entire community. Touring through the 7-Day War. At 1:50 p.m., Saturday, October 6, 1973, Syria opened a barrage of gunfire on the Golan Heights and invaded Israel with her mighty T-62 Russian tanks. It was Israel's most holy day of the year, Yom Kippur, and the entire nation was at worship. Within minutes, every city and town in Israel heard sirens scream, and the Middle East was again at war. Finally, 8 Arab nations joined in the carnage to regain lost territory and conquer the state of Israel. As the teletype at our radio station in South Bend, Indiana, told the story of the new hostilities, I had to make a decision regarding a tour I had scheduled to depart New York for Israel in just 2 days. I had been in Israel during the Sinai War in 1956. At that time, I was living in Jerusalem with my family. Even when the American ambassador and consul themselves had both departed the country and urged my family to do the same, we had chosen to stay. To my knowledge, we had been the only American family remaining during the war. God had protected us that time, and I knew He was able to do it again. When our tour group got to New York, we found that a young lady who worked for the tour company had already changed our itinerary and was sending the group to Turkey. I called my people together and announced, "We are going to the Holy Land. This woman here has nothing to do with it. This is my tour. We are flying out of here tonight and going to Rome first, and from there to Israel." We got to Rome, all right, but there were no flights going into Israel. Every airline had canceled. Our group flew next to Athens, Greece, where I asked, "Is anybody going to Israel at all?" An Israeli El Al Airlines official answered, "Yes, we are going, but we don't have any passengers to take. We are flying empty." I said, "How would you like to take 67 people?" "We would love it," was the reply. I asked the man to call Jerusalem and see if we would be welcomed. I then called my people together and told them, "Now I am going to Israel, in spite of this war between the Arabs and the Jews. If you want to go with me, you may, and if not, you can either stay here or return to New York." Only 2 people dropped out of the tour and returned home. Each of the others signed a release of personal responsibility for the tour company. What a thrill it was to set down at 10 minutes past midnight upon Israeli soil at Lod Airport. There were no custom formalities, just a big welcome. We found Israel surprisingly quiet and tranquil. Ours was the only tour group in the whole country, and every hotel was closed. They opened a fine hotel in Jerusalem just for us and brought us a bus driver from the Sinai battlefront to drive us through the land. Never in more than 30 trips to Israel have I been treated more royally. We were visited at our hotel by the Israeli Minister of Tourism, who expressed his appreciation for our presence. Our only inconvenience was the nightly blackouts, but they weren't too inconvenient because our group held special prophecy studies in the evening. I have never seen a group enjoy a tour more. We will never forget the night in Jerusalem when we met in an underground auditorium with a local group of believers made up of many denominations. The meeting room was down steep steps with no outside windows. Again, the blackout did not hinder us. One night in Jerusalem, I took a group of our men for a walk to the Old City at about midnight. We were stopped by a military jeep which threw its lights on us, and I immediately said, "We are Americans." Otherwise, we just spoke to the machine gun-carrying soldiers as we passed them at every corner. In the daytime, we could watch the dashing jets as they flew towards Syria over the Sea of Galilee or down the Mediterranean coast toward Egypt. Sleeping in Tiberias, we heard the roar of the cannons as one of the largest tank battles of history was being fought. Some 1,500 tanks at one time were engaged in conflict. We saw many of these captured Russian tanks being pulled back into Israel for repair to use in the Israeli army. We were permitted to photograph war zones and captured equipment as well. We were able to visit all the points on our itinerary except the Dead Sea, which was near the battle zone. Our pilgrims were taken on a boat trip across the Sea of Galilee near the Golan Heights, never doubting that God was watching over us. As we were departing Israel on the following Monday, we heard the news of Sunday's United Nations Council ceasefire resolution. The war was over, and Israel was the victor. Knowing Bible prophecy, that was no surprise to us. 65 happy people returned to America with a renewed assurance that God watches over his own.